Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be here.
Today is going to be, well, it's going to be a dense one, but in a really fascinating way. We are stepping away from pure theory for a moment and looking at a very specific, very messy, very human machine.
That's a good way to put it. A machine that was built in public, in the rain, often in the cold. It ran for about 2 months, and then, well, it was dismantled by the state.
We are, of course, talking about Occupy Wall Street.
Exactly. And before you, our listener, think this is just going to be a nostalgia trip back to 2011 or another debate about whether it worked or failed, I really want to stop you right there.
Right. That's not the mission here. The premise of this deep dive is not to reminisce. We're not here to talk about the vibe or the drum circles, though we will get to the drum circle.
Oh, we will definitely get to the drum circle.
We are here to analyze Occupy as a system. We're using the book Occupy, Scenes and Dispatches from the Movement, edited by Carla Blumenkranz, as our source text. And our goal is to strip away the romance and the criticism and just look at the blueprints.
We want to look at the structural design, the incentives, the feedback loops, the architecture of what they called horizontal leadership, and maybe most importantly, the inevitable friction that occurs when you try to redesign society inside a privately owned public park.
So let's frame this properly. We're treating the protest not as just an event, but as a design challenge. Imagine you're a systems engineer and you get this prompt. Build a direct democracy from scratch.
Okay.
You have no budget, no formal leaders. You're in the middle of a city that is, let's say, less than thrilled to have you there, and the police are watching your every move. Go.
That is the prompt. And the result was one of the most interesting social experiments of the 21st century.
Okay, so let's start with the context. The user interface of the protest, because I think a lot of people's memory of this is shaped by later news clips, not how it actually began on the ground.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
If you read the dispatch from Eli Schmidt in the book, the experience of arriving at Wall Street in September 2011 was, well, it was confusing.
It wasn't the big cinematic crowd scene we might imagine.
Not at all. He describes getting off the subway in the financial district, and he's expecting this massive visible uprising, a sea of people, banners, chanting. But his first experience wasn't a crowd. He says it was a maze.
A maze of police barricades.
Exactly. He walks out of the station, walks right into a policeman, and realizes that Wall Street itself isn't even accessible. It's locked down. The system had physically walled itself off before the protest even really started.
There's this really striking image he paints of tourists taking pictures with the cops in front of the barricades. It's like the protest hadn't fully rendered yet.
It was just the security state and the tourism industry coexisting. And it highlights this immediate sense of exclusion. The public street, the iconic Wall Street, wasn't public at all.
Which is such a profound systemic insight right from page one. The very target of the protest Wall Street was an abstraction. It was protected by these layers of steel and blue uniforms.
The physical architecture of the city had literally been reconfigured to protect the financial architecture.
Yeah.
So the movement had a problem. They couldn't occupy the street they wanted to occupy.
So they had to relocate, they had to find a different space, and they found this glitch in the city's zoning code.
Zuccotti Park.
Or Liberty Plaza, as it was originally named. And the key here is the legal designation, a privately owned public space.
That phrase is doing so much work. That legal distinction is everything.
Because it wasn't a city park, right? It wasn't like Central Park where there's a curfew, the Parks Department comes around and kicks you out at midnight.
Precisely. It was a legal gray zone. The land was owned by a corporation, Brookfield Properties, but as part of a deal with the city, they were legally required to keep it open to the public 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And that tiny loophole in the municipal code is what allowed the entire system of the protest to boot up.
100%. If that park had been city property with a curfew, Occupy Wall Street as we know it would have ended on night one. The police would have just swept them out.
So they find the space, they set up camp, but this is where we get to the central question that the book keeps circling, and it's the one I really want to dig into with you. What happens when a movement explicitly rejects the vertical power structure?
This is the core design feature. This is the whole experiment. Most of our society runs on a vertical operating system, right?
Absolutely.
You have a boss who has a boss who has a CEO. You have a voter who elects a representative who sits in a Congress. It's all about hierarchy. Information flows up and commands flow down.
And Occupy decided to try and run a completely different OS, a horizontal one.
Marina Citron writes about this really powerfully in the book. She focuses on the decision not to use the framework of demands.
And that just drove the media crazy. I remember watching cable news back then, and it was the only question they could ask.
Constantly. Anderson Cooper, the New York Times, everyone, what do they want? Give us the list of demands. Is it a tax hike? Is it banking regulation? What is the one thing?
But Citrin points out that the goal wasn't to ask authority for something. The goal was to create a new authority.
Yes. Think about it systemically. If you make a demand, you are implicitly acknowledging that the person you're demanding it from has the power to grant it.
You're validating their authority.
You're reinforcing the very power structure you claim to be protesting. It's a transaction. We will stop protesting if you give us X. By refusing to make demands, Occupy was trying to make a much more radical statement. They were trying to say, we are generating power right here among ourselves.
Citrin uses the term horizontalidad, horizontalism.
Yeah, and it's a concept borrowed from the Argentine movements after their economic collapse in 2001. The idea is that instead of looking up to a leader or the state for answers, you look across. You look at your neighbor. You build power together.
It sounds incredibly idealistic, almost poetic.
It is. But structurally, it creates a massive vacuum. If you don't have leaders and you don't have demands, what actually binds people together?
Right. Usually a movement is defined by its goal. End the war. Pass this law. Vote for candidate X. If the goal isn't a specific policy outcome, what's the glue holding thousands of strangers together in a park?
Shared precarity. That's the glue.
And there's this one anecdote from Astra Taylor in the book that I think just perfectly illustrates this entire dynamic.
It's an incredible scene.
She's at the park, and there's this guy. She describes him as being like a carnival barker, and he's standing on a bench shouting, step right up, tell us how much you are worth to the 1%.
It's a game of debt poker. It's brilliant.
It's amazing. He has a piece of cardboard and a marker, and he's asking people to come up and just write down their debt. Total anonymity, just the number.
And Astra Taylor wrote down her number. $42,000 for her student loans. And she writes about how her stomach just sank writing it down. It was a secret shame.
Shame is such a powerful tool of social control. It's an isolation mechanism. If you have debt, the default feeling is that you failed. You made bad choices. You took the wrong major. You spent too much. You weren't smart enough. It keeps you atomized.
Totally. It privatizes a systemic problem.
But then she hands the marker to the young woman next to her, early 20s, looks totally put together, and that woman writes $120,000.
And then the guy behind her writes $75,000. And on and on.
And that's the moment. That's the aha moment for the whole system. It wasn't just anger driving people there. It was a sudden collective crisis of perception.
People realized that their personal financial failures were actually systemic features. My debt isn't my shame. It's a data point. The girl next to me has the same data point, just with a different number. The guy behind me is facing foreclosure.
Suddenly the shame just evaporates. It's replaced by solidarity.
It's like turning on the lights in a dark room.
Yeah.
Once all the individual data points are revealed, you suddenly see the graph. You see the pattern.
You realize, oh, this isn't my personal failure. This is a structural design. And that realization, that shared vulnerability, bonds people faster and more deeply than any political speech ever could. The debt becomes the shared reality.
So the debt is the shared reality. But how do you govern that reality without leaders? This is where we need to get into the weeds of the machinery. Let's move into that core systems analysis, the central piece of design, the General Assembly.
The GA.
To an outsider or, someone watching on TV from a helicopter, the GA just looked like a chaotic, disorganized meeting in a mosh pit.
Yeah, just a bunch of people waving their hands around.
But in the book, it's described as something much more intentional. It's a piece of procedural architecture. It's the central processing unit of the movement.
And it had some very, very specific hardware constraints. The biggest one being no electricity, no microphones.
The NYPD banned amplification devices. They cited noise ordinances, which is just a classic bureaucratic tool of control.
Which, of course, leads to the single most famous piece of technology to come out of Occupy, the human mic.
The human mic. And we have to analyze this not just as a clever workaround, but as a systemic feedback loop. Since you couldn't use a megaphone, the crowd itself had to become the sound system.
Let's just walk through how this actually worked for anyone who hasn't seen it in action. If I'm speaking to a crowd of, say, 1,000 people, I can't just yell. So I say, mic check.
And the 50 people closest to you, the inner circle, they yell back, mic check.
Then I say, we are here today, in a short, clear phrase.
And that first circle of people yells, we are here today. And the next circle of people behind them hears it and repeats it, and it ripples outwards.
To build a new world.
To build a new world.
Yeah.
And the sound propagates through the crowd.
Now, just stop and think about the systemic effect of that mechanism. First, it slows down the transfer of information dramatically.
You literally cannot speak faster than the crowd can repeat you. You're forced to speak in these short, punchy, almost poetic bursts.
It forces active listening. You can't just zone out and check your phone. You are the transmission medium. You are the wire carrying the signal.
And it fundamentally changes the nature of rhetoric. It's very difficult to be a demagogue, to rant and rave and work a crowd into a frenzy when you have to pause every 4 words for several hundred people to echo you.
It's a cooling mechanism.
That's a brilliant observation. It inherently cools down the rhetoric. It filters out complexity and nuance. If you need to make a really complicated point about collateralized bed obligations, the human mic is a terrible tool. It favors slogans. It favors simplicity.
And it favors patience. Which brings us to the actual software running on this hardware, the theology of consensus.
Ellie Kaufman has a fascinating essay in the book where she traces the lineage of this, because I think a lot of people just assumed Occupy invented this whole hand-waving consensus process on the spot.
I'll admit, I kind of did. I thought it was just improvisation.
But it has this deep, fascinating history. Kaufman traces it all the way back to the Quakers, the Society of Friends, in the 17th century. They developed a method to find this sense of the meeting.
Sense of the meeting. I like that phrasing.
They rejected voting. To them, voting was inherently competitive. It's adversarial. If we vote on an issue and my side wins 51-49, that just means 49% of the room is unhappy. I've defeated you.
It creates winners and losers.
Exactly. The Quakers wanted unity. They believed that if everyone waited and listened patiently to the inner light, a unified truth would eventually emerge that everyone could consent to.
So it was originally a spiritual practice.
It was. But then, fast forward to 1976. The Clamshell Alliance, a group protesting nuclear power plants in New England, adopts the model. They stripped out the theology but kept the mechanism.
Why? What problem were they trying to solve?
They want to avoid what they call the tyranny of structurelessness, where in a supposedly leaderless group, the loudest, most charismatic person just ends up unofficially taking over. But they also didn't want official bosses, so they adopted consensus with the hand signals.
The twinkle fingers for agreement?
Twinkle fingers for agreement, a downward hand for disagreement, and then the most powerful and problematic one, the block.
That's when you cross your arms in an X, right?
Yes, a block is not just, I disagree. A block means, I believe this decision violates the fundamental principles or ethics of our group, and I cannot allow it to proceed. It's a veto. It stops everything.
That sounds incredibly powerful.
It is. And in a small, high-trust group like a Quaker meeting or a Clamshell Alliance affinity group where everyone knows each other, it can work. But now, imagine trying to implement that system with 2,000 complete strangers in a park in Lower Manhattan.
It sounds like a recipe for total gridlock.
It often was. And this exposes the core design flaw, or at least the core trade-off: time. Consensus is incredibly time-consuming. It favors those who have the most time and the most stamina.
Right. If a meeting to decide whether to buy more tarps takes 6 hours because one person keeps blocking the proposal,
Yeah.
who can actually afford to stay for that?
Students, maybe.
Yeah.
Unemployed people, yes. People with independent wealth.
A single parent who needs to get home to their kids, a nurse who has to be at the hospital for a 12-hour shift in the morning.
Absolutely not. So the system, in its pursuit of total inclusion, inadvertently filters for a certain kind of availability. It privileges time.
So the incentive structure is optimized for legitimacy and participation, but at the expense of speed and strategic coherence.
100%. And there's a scene in the book that captures this perfectly. An Egyptian activist, someone fresh from the revolution in Tahrir Square, comes to Zuccotti. He's a veteran of a very different kind of uprising.
And he's watching this endless slow-motion consensus process, the hand-waving, the repeating.
And he gets so frustrated. He grabs the non-mic and shouts, "Choose your leaders now. Choose one demand or you are lost."
Because he comes from a context where the stakes were immediate life and death. They needed to bring down a dictator. They needed speed and decisiveness.
Exactly. And the crowd and Zuccotti just rejects his advice. They kind of drown him out because the system they had built was designed to repel centralization. It viewed efficiency as a threat.
The fear was that if you become efficient, you become hierarchical. You might become the very thing you're fighting.
So instead of a central brain, they built this distributed network, the working groups.
Right. Food, Legal, sanitation, media, a medical tent, even a library. They had a working group called Safer Spaces, which was their version of security.
And these were the decentralized nodes of the system. They didn't need to get permission from the General Assembly to peel potatoes. The food working group just peeled potatoes. The legal group just trained legal observers.
Manissa Maharwal has this really wonderful piece where she describes the texture of the park. It captures this planned chaos. She's standing there, and on one side of the park, there's a talent show happening.
A talent show in the middle of this grand protest against global capitalism.
Yeah, jugglers, poets, people singing slightly off-key acoustic covers. And right next to it, maybe 20 feet away, there's an incredibly intense anti-patriarchy meeting where people are deconstructing gender theory.
And somewhere else, someone is looking for a lost phone, and the kitchen is chopping carrots for a giant stew.
It sounds like utter chaos.
It is chaos, but it's the system working exactly as designed. The core principle was autonomy over uniformity. There was no central committee to say, hey, cancel the talent show. It makes us look unserious. We have to focus on smashing the patriarchy right now.
Both could exist simultaneously.
And they did. But this is where it gets really interesting for our analysis. Because when you have that much autonomy, when you have a system designed to allow almost anything except leaders, you're going to get friction. And not just friction with the police outside the park, but friction inside the system itself.
Okay, so this brings us to the systems mapping part of our deep dive. Let's explicitly map the actors. Internally, you've got the General Assembly, which was often perceived as the more intellectual, academic, and frankly, whiter part of the movement.
The brain, so to speak.
Huh.
Then you have the drum circle.
The pulse.
The pulse. And this became a major, major point of internal conflict.
I remember reading about this in the mainstream news at the time and thinking it was a joke. Like, the hippies are fighting over the drums, how silly. But inside the park, this was a genuine constitutional crisis for their little microstate.
It really was. You have the drummers who would play for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day.
Relentlessly, a constant driving beat.
And then you have the General Assembly, maybe 50 feet away, trying to have these very delicate, slow, consensus-based discussions. Twinkle fingers if you agree with the proposal regarding the library's cataloging system. And in the background, it's just bum, 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 bum.
You have a clash of systems. The audio system of the drums was literally overpowering the audio system of the human mic.
And the book points out that this conflict got coded in these really uncomfortable ways very quickly.
Right. It wasn't just about noise. It got framed as mind versus body, intellect versus rhythm.
And often there was this racial and class coding that went along with it. The white intellectual GA versus the more diverse working class primitive drummers, even if the demographics weren't actually that clean-cut.
It became a huge stress test for the movement's principles. How do you tell someone to stop expressing themselves in a movement that is built on the idea of free expression?
If you tell the drummers to stop, are you not just acting like the police? Are you imposing your own noise ordinance?
So what was the resolution? They couldn't vote them out. There were no leaders to make an executive decision.
So they did the most systemic thing imaginable. They bureaucratized the problem.
They made the drum circle into a committee.
Essentially, yes. The drummers formed their own working group, which they called POLES.
Yeah.
And as a working group, they could then interface with the General Assembly. They negotiated, they agreed to limit drumming to certain hours. I think it was 2 hours a day.
And they moved to the west side of the park, away from the GA.
It's this incredible example of the system trying to absorb its own outliers into its own bureaucracy. The immune response was, if you are a problem, you must become a working group so we can have a meeting with you.
That is fascinating. The system's response to chaos is to generate more structure. We can't expel you, so we will file you.
But there was another friction point that was much, much harder to solve. And honestly, this is the part of the book that feels the heaviest and the most challenging, the question of the homeless population in the park.
This is the friction point that I think really exposes the absolute limits of the system's design. And we have to look at the source material here from Christopher Herring and Zoltan Glick, who analyzed this.
So let's set the stage. Remember the context. The 2008 financial crisis. In its wake, the city and state had slashed social services. Funding for mental health, homeless shelters, food stamps, all of it was cut.
So you have a large and growing population of unhoused and desperate people in New York City.
And suddenly, in the middle of lower Manhattan, this park appears. And in this park, there is a 247 kitchen serving free hot food. There are medical tents with volunteer doctors and nurses. There's a tent with free clothes. And there's a big welcoming sign that says basically, everyone is welcome. We are the 99%.
It's a magnet. It was for a time a better social safety net than the city of New York was providing.
It became a service provider of last resort. But this is where the systemic clash happens. The original organizers, the quote-unquote activists, they were focused on political legitimacy. They wanted to maintain a clean narrative for the media. The narrative was, we are the 99% and we are here to protest the banks.
They did not want the narrative to become, look at this shantytown of vagrants that has sprung up downtown.
That's a harsh way to put it, but that was the deep-seated fear. They worried that if the park became seen primarily as a homeless encampment, the political message would be completely lost. The media would focus on that and ignore the critique of finance.
And this led to this incredible tension. There's this quote in the book from a declaration that was read out in the General Assembly. And reading it now, it just sounds incredibly cold. The statement was, if you live in New York, go home. If you are homeless in New York, there are plenty of places to be homeless. Go there.
Wow, there are plenty of places to be homeless. That's brutal.
It's the system crashing against its own ideals. You have a movement dedicated to fighting exclusion, suddenly and explicitly reproducing the very exclusion it claims to be fighting.
They're essentially saying, we are the 99%, but not you. You're the wrong kind of 99%. You were too messy for our revolution.
And it was driven by a resource constraint, right? They simply couldn't feed and shelter every homeless person in New York.
Resources were finite, and the incentives were misaligned. But we have to balance this view. There's a story in the book about a homeless woman in Occupy Oakland named Jane, and she puts it perfectly. She said she prefers sleeping in the camp to the city shelters because, quote, here I feel like I have a voice.
She wasn't just there for the free soup.
No, she was there for the dignity. In a city shelter, you're a number. You are a problem to be managed. In Occupy, for all his flaws and friction, she could stand up in the General Assembly and say, mic check. She could participate. She was a citizen of that small world.
So it's this fundamental conflict between moral legitimacy, our principles say we help everyone, and political legitimacy. We need to look like a serious, coherent movement to the outside world.
And the state, the city government, they understood this friction perfectly. Mayor Bloomberg and the NYPD, they didn't raid the park because of anti-capitalist revolution.
Right.
They raided the park citing health and safety concerns.
They weaponized the sanitation issues.
They pointed to the rats, the trash, the lack of proper bathrooms, all problems that were exacerbated by the influx of the very people the state itself had abandoned. And they used it as the pretext to say, we have to clear the park for your own good.
Which brings us to the external actors, the feedback loops between the protesters, the police, and the media. Because while all this internal friction was happening, the external pressure was, ironically, one of the main things holding the movement together.
This is such a classic system dynamic. An external threat increases internal cohesion. The police strategy was primarily one of containment. Barricades, frozen zones, penning people in.
Like the mass arrest on the Brooklyn Bridge. Sarah L. writes about this in the book. Over 700 people arrested in one go.
Let's just analyze that event from a systems perspective. The police lead the protesters onto the main roadway of the bridge. Then, white-shirted officers block the front, then they block the back. It's a classic kettle maneuver.
And then they just start arresting everyone one by one with zip ties.
Now, in a traditional vertical system, arresting 700 people, including what might be the core organizers, could break the command structure. You cut off the head of the snake.
But Occupy was a starfish.
It was a starfish. You cut off a leg, another one grows. There were no official leaders to arrest. But more importantly, the arrests themselves created a powerful media feedback loop.
The images from that bridge were everywhere.
Police brutality became the movement's marketing engine. Every time the NYPD pepper sprayed someone, like those infamous videos of the young women being sprayed while they were already penned in orange netting, that video went viral.
And what was the immediate result of that going viral?
Donations poured in.
Yeah.
Attendance at the park swelled. The moral capital of the occupation just skyrocketed.
So the police, in trying to suppress the protest, were inadvertently doing its recruiting.
Precisely. The system of the protest thrived on the visible repression of the state. It's a fascinating counterfactual to consider. What if the police had just ignored them? Let them drum until they got bored? Let the cold winter weather set in? The movement might have just fizzled out due to the internal friction we were just talking about.
The drummers might have finally driven the GA members away.
It's possible. The police crackdown kept the unity alive because it gave them a very clear, very visible shared enemy.
Which connects to this idea of the invisible enemy of finance versus the visible enemy of the NYPD.
Yes, and let's get into that with our interconnection analysis. Keith Kesson has a great piece on this realization. You can't march on a derivative.
Right, you can't occupy a hedge fund's algorithm. Wall Street, the actual system of finance, is a global digital network. It's servers in New Jersey and fiber optic cables under the Atlantic Ocean. It's everywhere and nowhere at once. You can't yell at it.
So they occupied the symbol, the Charging Bull statue on Broadway.
And what was the state's response?
The police immediately surrounded the statue. They put up barricades to protect the piece of bronze.
And Gesson points out the incredible irony. The police were visibly prioritizing the physical safety of a bronze statue over the constitutional right of citizens to assemble.
It made the invisible visible. By physically placing their bodies in the heart of the financial district, they forced the state to reveal its priorities in the starkest possible terms. We will beat you with batons to protect this intersection. We will arrest you to protect this statue. That revelation was the product.
That's a powerful way to frame it. The product wasn't a law or a new regulation. The product was that moment of clarity, a showing of cards. Okay, but let's talk about persistence. Because the camps were cleared. The tents were torn down and thrown in sanitation trucks. November 15th, 2011, the raid happens. Zuccotti is power washed and sterilized. Physically, it was over. So, from a systems perspective, did it fail?
This is where we have to analyze the persistence of the critique. The argument made throughout the book is that while the physical encampments were incredibly fragile and temporary, the critique they embodied proved to be remarkably durable.
We are the 99%.
That slogan did so much heavy lifting. Just think about the political conversation in the U.S. before Occupy. In 2009, 2010, what was the dominant narrative?
It was the Tea Party. It was all about the deficit, sovereign debt.
Exactly. The narrative was austerity. We have to tighten our belts. We all live beyond our means. The entire conversation was framed around cutting the budget, cutting Social Security.
And after Occupy.
The entire conversation shifted to inequality, the 1% versus the 99%. That vocabulary, that framework, it just did not exist in the mainstream before Zuccotti Park.
It fundamentally shifted the Overton window.
It changed the language of politics. The movement was never designed to produce policy. It didn't result in a bill that President Obama signed into law. It was designed to produce a new identity, a class consciousness. And in that specific goal, you could argue it succeeded wildly. That language powered Bernie Sanders' campaigns. It's embedded in our political discourse today.
And some of the structures persisted too, right? The actual techniques.
The software survived the destruction of the hardware. The twinkle fingers for agreement, the mic check as a call and response. You still see these tactics at protests today for climate justice, for racial justice. The language of the movement outlived the physical space.
However, we do have to be realistic about the constraints. The book ends on a pretty sobering note about the raid and what it represented.
It's the hard lesson of structural asymmetry. You cannot fight a vertical system, the police, the state, the sanitation department, purely with a horizontal system indefinitely.
Because the vertical system is just faster and more decisive.
It's faster, it has a clear chain of command, and most importantly, it has a monopoly on legitimized force. Consensus is a beautiful democratic tool, but it cannot decide how to defend a park against a fully equipped SWAT team in real time. By the time the General Assembly could even begin to debate a defense strategy, the police have already cleared the park.
So the internal governance logic of the movement, Consensus, was operating inside a larger, hostile system, municipal law, that was optimized for hierarchy and enforcement.
And the larger, faster system eventually just physically crushed and cleared the smaller, slower system. Slow, deliberative democracy was overwhelmed by fast executive authority.
So what does this all mean for today? This brings us to the present-day implications. Why are we talking about a book about 2011 now?
Because we keep seeing this pattern, this core tension recur over and over. I think of it as the leaderless trap.
You see it everywhere in digital movements.
Absolutely. Look at how mobilization happens on social media. Twitter or X or whatever platform is dominant now. It is, in effect, a giant, chaotic digital General Assembly.
Everyone has a mic. There's a constant mic check on some scandal or outrage.
Exactly. These platforms are incredible at generating outrage. They are fantastic at making a topic trend. Did you see what this politician said? Boom, it's everywhere in an hour.
It's easy to gather a crowd online. It's incredibly hard to decide where that crowd should march.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
Digital movements are often incredibly powerful, but also incredibly fragile, because they lack the mechanisms to deliberate, negotiate, and decide. If you have no leaders and no formal structure, who decides when you've won? Who negotiates with the powers that be?
The book also really captures the genesis of this deep institutional distrust that feels so prevalent now.
This is a huge generational shift that Occupy crystallized. The contributors to this book, the writers, students, unemployed workers, they came to a realization. The liberal critique is usually, the system is broken, we need to fix it.
Occupy's critique was much deeper, wasn't it?
It was that the institutions were working exactly as designed. The university was designed to put you into lifelong debt. The bank was designed to foreclose on your home if you miss a payment. The police were designed to protect the bronze bull.
And once you perceive the system that way, you can't unsee it. That right there is the crisis in perception we talk about on this channel.
It is. And that's why we're not offering any prescriptions in this deep dive. We're not saying, here's what activists should do next time. We are observing a recurring structural problem. Any movement for deep, radical change will face this exact same trade-off.
The trade-off between the speed of action and the depth of democracy.
You can have one or you can have the other. It is almost impossible to have both at the same time. If you want deep democracy, where every single voice is heard, where the homeless person and the Harvard grad have an equal say, it is going to be messy. It's going to be slow and inefficient, and the state will just wait you out.
So let's bring it to our conclusion. After digging through Occupy, Scenes and Dispatches, what does this book really help us see? What's the key takeaway?
I think the biggest lesson is about democratic design. It teaches us that real, bottom-up democracy is exhausting. It's noisy. It often smells like a drum circle and wet wool blankets. It is not the pristine theoretical concept we read about in the political science textbook. It's a messy human process.
And what about institutional inertia?
That the status quo has more time than you do. The system has shifts, it has budgets, it has bureaucracy, it can afford to wait for winter to set in, it has patience on its side.
I keep coming back to that Thomas Paine quote that's referenced in the text from The American Crisis.
The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. But I think there's another layer to it in this context. It's the realization that the struggle itself, the process, is the point. There's that phrase about the presence of an effect towards which they have done everything.
What do you take that to mean?
I take it to mean that the act of occupying, the act of building this messy, flawed, temporary world was the victory. Because for 2 months, it proved that a different way of living together was possible, even if it was just in one square block of concrete, even if it was just for a little while.
It was a working prototype.
A prototype that ultimately crashed, but it left us the source code, and we're still trying to debug it.
A system that failed in space, but seems to have succeeded in time. And that's where we'll leave it. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.